Welcome to the Israel-Palestine Report. As more and more people filter into the live, I am going to start from welcoming everyone. If this is your first time joining this live event, I am Alon Burstein. I am an Israel Institute Fellow and a professor of political science at Tufts University. And what we do in the Israel-Palestine Report is we look at everything that is going on in this area of the Middle East. Those of you who are joining are probably aware this area is not known for its peaceful nature. A lot of conflict, and specifically over the last 2 years, we have been following very closely what is happening in the Israel-Hamas War, and specifically within the Gaza Strip, Israel, and the surrounding arena. So, as more people filter in, I am going to say this a few times. The first comment on the chat above, which I hope people can see, is a link to a Google form that will take you to sign up to the newsletter of the Israel-Palestine Report. A few people have signed up already. I haven't sent out any emails yet. I am now collecting a database of emails to start sending out updates for when I do these live shows and about other updates that I'm going to do with regards to the channel. So feel free to go in and sign up. I promise I will not send a lot of spam emails to those who sign up. It's just in order to let people be up to date as to what is happening on our channel. So, hi to those who have already joined. Please feel free as you come in to say hi on the chat. Let me know where you're joining from. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free at any point to ask the questions. I'm going to pause throughout my talk and try to field the questions. I do recommend, however, just because sometimes the chat gets a little full, if you have a question, please preface it with the word question or Q or something so that I know that it's highlighted as I'm moving through the chat. Again, going to take a few more seconds before I get started, welcoming everyone who is still joining in. If you have any preliminary questions as to what has happened over the last week in the Gaza Strip or in Israel or in the West Bank, feel free to send it already in the chat. Meanwhile, I will say what we are going to be talking about broadly throughout the next hour or so is going to start from reviewing what has happened in the Gaza Strip over the last week, and specifically with regards to the implementation of the first phase of the agreement between the sides. I was going to say peace treaty, but it is not a peace treaty. It is at this point an agreement, at best a ceasefire. And we're going to talk about what has progressed as far as the implementation, where has it still faltered, where do things stand. After that, we're going to go on to talking about the main development of the last week, which is the implementation and preparing to implement phase 2 of the ceasefire. Phase 2 of the agreement is the big one, so to speak. As part of Trump's 20-point plan, phase 2 talks about the complete revamping of the Gaza Strip, demilitarizing, disarming Hamas, the Israeli military withdrawing, the establishment of a board of peace, the establishment of an international stabilization force that's going to be made up of multiple armies that are going to come into the Gaza Strip, and paving the way, as we're going to see, possibly to a different future, maybe even a two-state solution. We're going to talk about the latest proposal of the United States to the UN Security Council and the revisions that it made that I will say have also angered Israel, and all that happened in the last several days. After that, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what is being prepared for the implementation, which armies are already training their soldiers to be sent to the Gaza Strip, and what does Israel have to say about this, and what does the Palestinian Authority or Hamas have to say about this. And before we conclude, at the end of the hour, I'm going to talk a little bit about the surrounding arenas, also what's going on between Israel and Lebanon, and also talk a little bit about the West Bank and what is going on. There's a constant bubbling over of violence there. We're going to address that a little bit as well. Those of you joining now, I'm just going to say again briefly, the first message in the chat is a link that will take you to sign up to the newsletter of the Israel-Palestine Report. Feel free to go in and fill out your details. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to throw them into the chat as well. And anyone else, if you have any other comments, feel free to load them up into the chat. I will try to address them as we go on. So with that, taking a moment, if anyone has any questions or anything to add, anything else you'd like me to focus on before I start diving in. People coming in from Michigan and from Orange County, California, where I used to live. One more thing I'll say, thank you to everyone who has sent me messages as you've seen that I have set up a new office. People have sent me messages about the light setup and about the microphone. Still a work in progress, but as always, feel free to send in any other comments. Always welcome any feedback. Again, this whole setup is so that people can actually learn as much as possible. One of the comments that I've gotten is to try to get bigger maps. I'm working on it. Hopefully, I will be able to get them in the coming weeks. Someone joining from Israel. It's 4 a.m. there. I salute your devotion. Okay, so I am going to start diving in to what has happened over the last week in the Gaza Strip and in Israel, and then move on from there to the larger picture of phase 2 of the plan. With regards to the implementation of phase 1, as a reminder, phase 1 of the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas relates primarily to 4 things: the return of all hostages and the bodies of all hostages in exchange for the release of Palestinian prisoners, return the bodies of prisoners, a truce between the sides, the vast entrance of humanitarian aid, Israeli military redeployment, and also the opening of the Rafah crossing. So, where are we? First, with regards to the hostage situation, over the last week, 4 more bodies of hostages were returned by Hamas. Many of these were excavated actually in the areas that is controlled by the Israeli military in the Gaza Strip. The Israeli military withdrew and allowed Hamas to enter with the Red Cross into the different areas, and 4 more bodies were returned, including that of Hadar Golden. I mentioned that because his body was held by Hamas in the Gaza Strip since 2014. With that, right now, there are, quote-unquote, only 3 bodies left of the hostages in the Gaza Strip. Of all the 255 hostages, all the live hostages that were still alive were returned when the deal commenced at the beginning of October, and the bodies of hostages have slowly been returned. Right now, there are 3 bodies that still remain in the Gaza Strip. According to Israeli intelligence from the last week, Israel does not actually believe that Hamas knows the location of all 3. Some reports suggested that Israel believes that the Palestinian Islamic Jihad knows the location of one of the bodies. Others have said they're not even sure about that. But what most reports are suggesting is that it is likely that the location of at least 2 bodies in the Gaza Strip is not known. That is going to pose an interesting dilemma because as far as Israel is concerned, all of the bodies have to be returned in order to declare the end of phase 1 and moving on to phase 2. However, if Israel also recognizes that the bodies cannot be located, is Israel going to agree to move on to implementing phase 2 of the deal? Likely Israel is going to say it's not willing to. Likely the United States is going to compel Israel to nonetheless move on to phase 2. But that's going to be an interesting dilemma as that happens. I'm estimating probably in the next week we may see the return of 1 more body of a hostage. However, that is likely all we're going to see for the time being. Israel also returned the bodies of over 45 Palestinians to the Gaza Strip and to the West Bank in exchange for those bodies being returned. And that is what was concluded in phase 1 as far as the hostages are concerned. As far as the humanitarian situation, I remind you that last week we had a very important development that went somewhat under the radar. I mentioned this in my report that I recorded last week, in which the United States took over the administering of all humanitarian aid that enters into the Gaza Strip. Up until now, all humanitarian aid would come through Israel. Even the humanitarian aid that would come in through Egypt had to be inspected and approved by Israel, and then would go into the Gaza Strip and be distributed by the different UN agencies. And last week, as a result of a lot of disagreements between Israel and the United States suddenly came out with an announcement saying they are now going to be the ones responsible for the supervision of all humanitarian aid that comes into Gaza. With that, Israel effectively is removed from its veto position on what humanitarian aid can come in, how much can come in, deciding on its type, and anything else that relates to this issue of humanitarian aid. With that, however, the United States Central Command, CENTCOM, announced on Friday that over the last week, an average of over 800 aid trucks were allowed into the Gaza Strip each day, and that is a substantial increase from what Israel was allowing in. On some weeks, Israel was allowing 600 trucks a day, on some weeks even less, and the United States is likely publishing this in order to actually show that there is meaning to the fact that it has taken over the humanitarian aid coming into Gaza. So over the last week, with regards to humanitarian aid, we have had a substantial increase in the amount of humanitarian aid coming into Gaza. That said, over the last 24 hours, there has been massive rainfall that has happened in Israel and in the Gaza Strip, causing major floods reported in the areas of Han Yunis and Rafah, as well as the rest of the Gaza Strip, but most of the population internally displaced is located in the Al-Mawasi refugee camps in these areas of Han Yunis and Rafah, and reportedly that area is in a complete disarray and disaster right now. Most tents have been flooded. The municipalities of Han Yunis have been raising a lot of complaints that Israel needs to allow more tents and more industrial equipment in to help deal with the flooding. So we'll see how that's going to play out with regards to the entrance of humanitarian aid. Right now, again, more aid trucks are coming in, but the actual infrastructure of what the Palestinian side is saying is necessary to deal with the humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. That side is saying at minimum they need more permanent housing, even if this is permanent temporary housing, but to have structures and caravans rather than tents, and also more equipment in order to deal with the flooding. But again, if I'm focusing on the implementation of phase one over the last week, so we had the return of the bodies of hostages. We had also the humanitarian situation. With regards to the Rafah crossing, that crossing has remained closed. That is one thing that has not moved over the last week. With the implementation of phase one, Rafah crossing was supposed to open for the entrance and exit of Palestinians, civilians, as well as the entrance of humanitarian aid. However, the sides have not managed to agree over who is going to staff the Rafah crossing. Is it going to be Palestinians from Gaza? Is it going to be the Palestinian Authority? Is it going to be the Israeli military? As a result, with regard to the implementation of phase one, Rafah crossing, at this point, still remains closed. The last aspect of the implementation of phase one of the agreement relates to the truce and the ceasefire between the sides. And that's the last I'm going to talk about at this stage before I'm going to turn to look at the chat and look at some of the questions. With regards to the truce between the sides, over the last week, the truce has largely been maintained. That is to say, we didn't see a complete collapse and return to fighting on all arenas in the Gaza Strip. At the same time, almost every day, we have had sporadic events of fighting that have broken out in different areas of the Gaza Strip, primarily in the areas of eastern Gaza City over here, and in the areas of Han Yunis and Rafah over here. In almost all of these cases, what happened was Palestinians, according to Israel, it was armed operatives. According to Palestinian side, usually it was civilians, had crossed over the yellow line. That is the demarcation line where the Israeli military has redeployed to, and approached IDF soldiers and were then attacked with airstrikes in order to theoretically protect the IDF soldiers as far as Israel is concerned. As far as the Palestinian side is concerned, this is done solely in order to deter and or to kill. And in most of those cases, those people were in fact killed. And again, at this point, there's no reports from Israel that there was actually any attack that occurred. Israel saying they were armed. So at this point, I'm just bringing in both sides. I don't actually know what the intent of those Palestinians in those different incidents may or may not have been. But again, just to look at some of the examples. On November 10th, at the beginning of the week, 2 people were killed as they crossed over the yellow line in the areas of Han Yunis. Israeli military reported it was 2 armed operatives. Palestinians reported it was a mother and child that were killed in Han Yunis. The next day, again, an incident that occurs in the more northern areas of Han Yunis, in the areas of Bani Suhaila over here. And according to Palestinian sources, people were attempting to excavate bodies of Palestinians from under the rubble, and they were attacked. Israel said that operatives had crossed the yellow line. Again, people were killed. On November 12th, we had a slightly different situation, and this again happened on Wednesday, when the Israeli military was carrying out an operation in the Janina area of Rafah, that is in the most southern area of Rafah over here. And according to reports, the Israeli military encountered 4 armed Palestinians that had held up in a building in that area. Now, I remind everyone that area is entirely controlled by the IDF, but there's still a lot of armed activity there. And then a gun battle ensued, and the 4 were killed. At this point, the Palestinian side did not report anything different. So that is a gun battle with armed operatives, and all 4 were killed. Then there was also an airstrike. So airstrikes were reported in northern Gaza on November 13th. And again, I'm only bringing this in to illustrate that while I say the ceasefire has been largely maintained, what I mean by that is that there's not been a complete collapse and a return to fighting on all sides and bombings of the Israeli military in the Palestinian area or Hamas operatives carrying out massive attacks against Israeli troops. That said, every day there's still these incidents, and we are not seeing a complete calm in the Gaza Strip. And it's important to emphasize that, not only in order to understand the situation in Gaza on a daily basis, but also because it's important to remember each one of these cases has the potential to spiral into a complete collapse of the ceasefire. In each one of these cases, if it were to happen, that there would happen to be footage, and it was in fact Palestinian women and children that were attacked by the Israeli military, or if it was armed Hamas operatives that managed to carry out a deadly attack, killing IDF soldiers, either one of those things has the potential to spiral the situation into a full-blown collapse of the ceasefire, and both sides are not indicating that they would not be willing to go to another round of fighting at this point. So at this point, the truce is being maintained, but I say it's very important to constantly be looking out for what are these small events, theoretically small events, that might lead to an explosion. Another report that happened in the last week with regards to the ceasefire being maintained, but meanwhile things happening on the ground, was a report in the BBC that came out on Thursday that said that satellite images are showing that on the side that is being maintained by the Israeli military, so that is mostly the side that is closer to the Israeli border over here, since the ceasefire has begun, Israel has still destroyed upwards of 1,500, 1,500 structures in that area. It would be questionable if this actually were to be filed as some sort of complaint to the United States, if this violates the truce or not. All military operations were supposed to have stopped since the truce began. However, Israel could argue that this is not a military operation. This is part of clearing the area out of booby-trapped buildings or something like that. So I'm not saying that there's a full-blown violation of the agreement. What I am saying is there's still militant activity that is happening in the Israeli side that has been reported by the BBC. Alongside this, while there were no reports of any Israeli soldiers that were killed over the last week, within these different reports of the Palestinians that were attacked as they crossed the yellow line, there are reports of upwards of 500 people who may have been killed in the last week, but I will say that's very, very, very likely associated with the excavation of more bodies of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. In other words, the Palestinian Health Ministry is reporting a jump in several hundred people that were killed in the war, but there's no reports in more than a dozen people that were killed in the actual fighting, so very likely what that is, and again, it's my own estimation, but as I'm looking at the news reports, much more likely that is associated with people who were killed prior to the ceasefire rather than killed only in the last week. So that's in terms of the truce and where things are. There's two more things I'm going to talk about in regards to what has been going on in the last week on the ground in the Gaza Strip before I turn to talking a little bit more broadly about phase two. But I'm going to take a pause for a water break and take a look at some of the comments, see what people are saying. There was a news report, someone says, there was a news report that someone in the U.S. government has to meet Hamas. Is this the case? Okay, so I'm going to repeat that question. There was a news report that someone from the U.S. government was going to meet with Hamas. Is this the case? Yes. In fact, that is the case. There are reports that Steve Witkoff, the special emissary of U.S. President Trump, and really the person who has orchestrated most of this agreement, is going to meet Khalil al-Hayya. Khalil al-Hayya is the chief negotiator of Hamas, and at this point, some would argue that he's at least one of the two strongest people within the Hamas leadership. The Hamas leadership is made up of 5 people at this point, but Khalil al-Hayya and Khalid Mashal are considered the 2 strongest people. And there are reports, Steve Witkoff has said that he's going to meet with Khalil al-Hayya. This caused a lot of questions within Israel. The meeting has not been set yet, but it is expected to happen, and I'll talk about that a little bit later when I talk about the implementation of phase 2. Another report that you may have seen is a meeting between Jared Kushner and a Yasser Abu-Shabab, who's not a member of Hamas. He's the commander of a militia in the Gaza Strip, but I'm going to talk about that in a moment. Looking a little bit, oh, thank you. People are saying that everything looks and sounds perfect. Thank you very much. Love comments like that. Hi, Becca, coming in a little late. Question. You just answered my question, reference the housing and flooding. Great, thank you for that. Another question. How much of the added CENTCOM tonnage is due to a reduction in security inspection compared to COJAT? So I'm going to rephrase that question. how much of the additional humanitarian aid that is coming into the Gaza Strip now that the United States has taken over inspecting humanitarian aid, how much of that increase is due to less inspection versus to allowing more trucks to come in? I have to be honest, at this point, I don't have a clear answer for that. The United States has said that they're not going to reduce the amount of inspection over the humanitarian aid trucks. It was reported in Israel that Israel is still going to be cooperating with the United States as to how much aid is going to come in and how it is actually being monitored and inspected. But at this point, we don't actually know. It's not public. What are the mechanisms that are used to inspect the aid trucks that come in? In my own analysis, I would say that it is more likely that the United States CENTCOM is simply allowing as much aid as possible in, and not necessarily doing less inspections, but is allowing as much aid as possible to come into the Gaza side because it has a vested interest in showing the Palestinian population and also showing all the actors involved, primarily the negotiating countries, Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey, that they are involved and that they can force Israel to increase the amount of aid or whatever they want in the Gaza Strip. It is very likely that Israel was limiting the amount of aid to 600 aid trucks per day because that was the minimum requirement. 600 aid trucks per day, according to the agreement, was the minimum requirement. And now with 800 aid trucks per day, it's more likely that the United States is simply allowing more aid in, not reducing inspection, but allowing more aid in. But again, that's my own speculation and analysis at this point. There's no clear answer because the procedures for inspecting the aid are not made public. Other question that I'm seeing, could it be possible that Hamas could be digging new tunnels? So, repeating that question again, could it be possible that Hamas is digging new tunnels? It is technically possible. Hamas certainly has shown that it has the ability to continuously refurbish itself, reinvent itself, train new operatives, and develop new weaponry even during the war. That said, there's two reasons why it is less likely that they're digging new tunnels at this point. One is there is a vast limitation on heavy industrial equipment that is coming into the Gaza Strip. A lot of it, the vast majority of it, was destroyed in the war. And while Israel has allowed some of it to come in, it is still under relatively tight inspection by drones and aerial cover. So it would be a lot more difficult at this point. A second reason is much more practical. According to the estimates in Israel that were published at the end of October, almost 75% of Hamas's tunnel array is still operative. Only 25% were completely destroyed. Israel's mapped out and knows the location of a lot of the other tunnels, but the majority of the tunnels are still up and running. So Hamas likely does not have a vast need for building more tunnels at this point. It's likely investing a lot more in developing its governing mechanisms in the Gaza Strip. Other questions that I am seeing. Any news on the... So I'm seeing a question about the 200 or so Hamas operatives in Rafah. That's exactly the next thing I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to use that as a segue in order to talk about the last two things with regards to what has happened in Gaza in the last week before turning to the implementation of Phase 2 and some of the political developments of the last week. So while I have talked about what has happened with regards to the truce and the, again, potential breakdown of the truce, but not full breakdown that has been happening, in addition to that, two more main things have been happening in the Gaza Strip on the ground over the past week. First, increasing reports. I say this every week. Increasing reports, Hamas is continuing to develop its governing mechanisms and infrastructures. Over the past weeks, I've reported that Hamas has set up new governors, then appointed new municipalities, then has started to take over distributing the humanitarian aid, then has started to take over rebuilding and repaving roads and setting up the internally displaced camps in the Gaza Strip, then has started to impose a tax on different merchants. On November 14th, so just yesterday on Friday, Reuters reported that Hamas now has also begun taxing poultry in the markets as well as cigarettes in the Gaza Strip. And again, the reason for that may sound petty, but the reason why that is important is because that already shows a much greater ability to collect taxes. If 3 weeks ago it was reported that Hamas has started to impose a tax on the larger merchants in the Gaza Strip, that means coming to the local warlords in the local markets and saying, I'm collecting a certain tax. if you're starting to pose attacks on the daily sale of cigarettes and chickens and other food products, that already means you have a much more developed hold on the economy. And the fact that that has happened over the last week is just another indication that while everything is still being held up, while the sides are still negotiating, trying to figure out what happens next, Hamas is not waiting. Hamas is developing its governing infrastructure and is doing it at an increasingly fast rate in the areas that it does control within the Gaza Strip. The next big thing that happened in the Gaza Strip over the last week has been a lot of talk and negotiation about a cluster of Hamas armed operatives that are located in the Janina regions in Rafah, in these areas over here. That area has been controlled by the Israeli military by now for over a year. However, when the truce was declared and the Israeli military set up more de facto permanent positions, at least for now, in the areas of Rafah, all of a sudden there started to be ambushes of operatives that were emerging from tunnels and attacking IDF troops. This happened 4 times in the first 2 weeks of the truce. After a while, it became apparent that there are between 100 to 200. Some reports are saying less. Al-Hadath this week reported 50 to 60. Some reports are saying between 100 to 200. So let's say about 100 or 150 armed Hamas operatives that have been held up in Rafah, in the area that's controlled by the Israeli military, some of them hiding within tunnels, some of them hiding in other areas. And the question has emerged what to do with them. Because, like I said, these attacks are each time a spark that could bring about the collapse of the ceasefire. So, the negotiating countries have started to apply pressure on Israel over the last week to figure out a solution and to possibly allow safe passage to those Hamas operatives to leave the areas of Janina and Rafah and travel north to these areas closer to the center of the Gaza Strip and Deir al-Balah, the areas that is controlled by Hamas. Now, Israel initially completely rejected this and completely said, no, their fate is only to be killed or to be captured. There is no such thing as safe passage to armed operatives. However, over the past week, that very harsh rhetoric from Israel began to crack. Already at the beginning of the week on Sunday, it was reported that Israel is considering the option of safe passage to those operatives from the areas of Janina. Then, on November 10th, Jared Kushner, President Trump's son-in-law and one of the chief advisors with regards to the Middle East, traveled to Israel and met with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. According to a multitude of reports, Kushner informed Netanyahu that the United States wants to allow the Hamas operatives to have safe passage out of the areas of Janina. Once they are disarmed, they will leave their weapons behind and have safe passage to travel to the areas in central Gaza. In Israel, there was initially no comment about this. However, later in the day after that meeting, the foreign spokesperson of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu stated that whatever decision happens with regards to those operatives, Israel will make the decision alongside in cooperation with the United States. This caused massive political backlash in Israel. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu tried to dial it back throughout the week, but then he put out a statement that already was a different rhetoric than they're going to be killed or captured, and said their fate will be whatever serves the state of Israel best. That's already indicating that Israel's realizing that they're likely going to have to acquiesce to some way to allow these operatives to leave. The next day, there were reports that Jared Kushner stated that the United States does not want Israel to risk engaging with these operatives and then possibly lead to collapse of the deal. They also said that Kushner reminded Netanyahu that Trump's 20-point plan also says that any Hamas operatives that lay down arms and that obliged to not return to terrorism will be granted amnesty. So the United States is starting to remind Israel, so to speak, that they are obligated to allow Hamas operatives to disarm and to receive some sort of amnesty. Over the next several days, there's been a lot of different reports. The one that is repeatedly emerging is that Israel is trying to work out some sort of deal that those operatives will be allowed safe passage, but will be exiled from the Gaza Strip. They will not be allowed to return to the areas controlled by Hamas to just be rearmed, but they will be exiled to a different location. However, that has run into two problems. One, Qatar, Turkey, and Egypt all announced they're not willing to take them. And also, the day before I recorded this, Hamas put out a statement saying they're not willing to accept exile because they don't want that to be the precedent. The people are supposed to get amnesty and remain in the Gaza Strip. That's what they are demanding. So at this point, that's where we are. There's still no solution. Israel has stopped the rhetoric that they only have to be captured or killed, but there's still no solution to allowing their safe passage. It will be very politically damaging to Netanyahu with his current coalition to allow that on the one hand. The other hand, clearly that is what the United States wants. And at this point, we don't really know what is going to be the solution that the sides come up with. Most people are estimating that eventually they'll come up with some sort of formula that allows the safe passage. Meanwhile, however, I'm going to remind everyone, I said that on Wednesday, we had that encounter between the Israeli military and Hamas armed operatives in Janina, and 4 of those operatives were killed. So while the sides are discussing what might happen, how will it happen, the situation there is very volatile because those armed operatives are still there, the Israeli military is still operating there, and we may see that spark at any moment. That is all I'm going to say right now about phase 1 of the deal, what's happened in the last week. The next thing that I'm going to talk about is a major political development, which is the way the United States has submitted to the UN Security Council a proposal for how phase 2 is going to be implemented. And it has made quite a few substantial changes in its proposed resolution. I spoke about this resolution already last week in my recording, but now it made some substantial changes, among others talking about a Palestinian state, removing Israel's veto over certain things. So I'm going to talk about that next. While right now, though, I'm going to take a break and take a look at the chat. Let us see what people are asking about. Other questions. What happened to the Hamas fighters stuck in the tunnels? What percentage of the 800 trucks are being taken over by Hamas? So I'm going to take that question and say a little bit more broadly. How much of the humanitarian aid that is coming into the Gaza Strip is being taken over by Hamas? At this point, we don't actually know. It is less likely that Hamas is systematically stealing the aid that is coming into the Gaza Strip, because I'll say at this point, they have less of a need to do that. During the active fighting, Hamas had a need to take over the humanitarian aid that would come into the Gaza Strip because it needed to distribute it to its fighting forces that were operating in the different fighting areas, in the tunnels, the area the guards were holding hostages, etc. At this point, when aid comes into the Gaza Strip and crosses over the yellow line, going into the areas of the Al-Wasi refugee camp, the Al-Banah, or the areas of southern Gaza City, Hamas is the governing authority in that area. So if the aid is distributed to the population, whatever is taken over by the government or bought up by the Hamas operatives at this point can be done openly. So there are less reports that Hamas is taking over wholesale aid trucks that are coming in, because they also have a lot less of a need for that. The aid trucks now come into central warehouses. It is Hamas governing officials that then are responsible for merchants coming into the warehouse, taking it to different areas, distributing it to the United Nations, to the different aid agencies. So at this point, there's less reports of Hamas taking over wholesale aid trucks because they also have less of a need to do that. They can operate much more publicly in taking over aid and distributing it to their operatives and their different governing officials. Hope that was clear. That seemed a little convoluted maybe. Let me know if you want any clarification on that. Question, have any Hamas fighters surrendered in exchange for amnesty? Great question. No. Until now, there has been no case of Hamas fighters surrendering in exchange for amnesty. It's also important to note, though, that that phase of the deal has theoretically not gone into effect. That is supposed to happen alongside the disarming of Hamas, so people are supposed to give up their weaponry and then receive amnesty if they declare they're not going to return to terror activity. There is no disarming that's happening now. That's part of the UN security, the United States proposal to the Security Council. So I'll talk about that in a minute. But no, there have not been any cases of anyone declaring that they're leaving terrorism and receiving amnesty yet. Question, is there a chance the Hamas-trapped fighters will die of hunger, or do they have access to food? Great question. At this point, it seems they do have certain access to food. Most of them, it seems, are not actually hiding in tunnels. They may be entering tunnels in order to carry out these ambushes, but most of them are simply in the ruined areas of Rafah, and very likely they have some access to food. Other questions, Professor? Funny comments that are coming in. Someone saying that they'll be wearing dentures by the time the 20th step is implemented. Maybe, you never know. What happened to the Gazans who were flown to South Africa? I'll try to answer that at the end because it'll be too much to explain at this point. Please forgive me. Who has the best chance of defeating Bibi next year? That's a question about internal Israeli politics. I'll also try to field that one at the end because, again, it's a bit of a distraction from what's happening in the Gaza Strip. And great questions. I just want to try to stay on topic. Giving another moment if anyone else has any questions about what's happening in the Gaza Strip meanwhile. And again, Fran and Tilly, please feel free to ask those questions again at the end. Thank you, Becca. Hydrating. So, right now, what I am going to turn to is looking at the political developments over the last week. And specifically, the biggest thing that has happened has been that the United States submitted its proposal of a resolution to the UN Security Council about implementing next phase of the deal, phase 2. Within that phase, what is supposed to happen is the Board of Peace is supposed to be established. That is supposed to be an overarching transitory governing authority in the Gaza Strip. There's supposed to be the establishment of the International Stabilization Force, that international military mechanism that is going to take over security in the Gaza Strip, the deployment of Palestinian police officers that are trained and vetted in the Gaza Strip, an Israeli military withdrawal, Hamas disarming, demilitarizing Gaza, and also questions about what happens next. So all that is part of phase 2 of the deal. Now, last week in my recording, I already talked about the draft proposal that had been submitted or that had been floated among the United States, different officials. So I'm not going to talk about every single article. It's a total of 11 articles. I'm not going to analyze each and every one. I am going to go through them one by one and talk about the main points, but mostly what I'm going to emphasize is the changes that the United States made in the actual resolution as was submitted later on in the week, was submitted 2 days ago, because some of those changes are extremely significant. So I'm now reading from the resolution that the United States submitted to the UN Security Council. It starts from welcoming a comprehensive plan to end the war and applauding the countries that signed it, welcome the historic Trump Declaration, etc., etc. After that, it determines that the situation in the Gaza Strip threatens regional peace and security and endorses the comprehensive plan of President Trump. One of the things that Article 1 added in this new resolution is that in addition to saying that it calls upon all parties to implement all 20 points of the plan, they added including maintaining the ceasefire, which means that in addition to calling upon all sides to uphold the plan, there's now an emphasis on maintaining the ceasefire. Possibly the biggest and most important change, or one of the two biggest and most important changes, comes in Article 2. Article 2 says that the UN Security Council welcomes the establishment of the Board of Peace as a transitional administration. And this is a change from the initial proposal that said in the transitional governance. Now they say transitional administration. So they changed it to not sound like it's going to be a government in the Gaza Strip, with international legal personality that will set the framework and coordinate funding for and redevelopment of Gaza pursuant to the comprehensive plan. So what this says is that this is the authorization of the Security Council to establish the Board of Peace. It then goes on to say that the Board of Peace will implement the different the different sides of phase 2 in accordance with all international legal principles until such time as the Palestinian Authority has satisfactorily completed its reform program. At this point, that is what the initial proposal said also. It said that the Palestinian Authority has satisfactorily completed its reform program. In the initial proposal, the draft from last week, it said the satisfaction of which shall be acceptable to the Board of Peace and to Israel. And that was how Article 2 ended. So in the initial proposal, it said that the Board of Peace is going to take over administering the Gaza Strip until the Palestinian Authority undergoes reforms that are accepted to the Board of Peace and to Israel. The actual proposal that was submitted to the UN Security Council 2 days ago varies quite greatly from this. What it says is that the Board of Peace will take over until such time as the Palestinian Authority has satisfactorily completed its reform program as outlined in various proposals, including President Trump's peace plan in 2020 and the Saudi-French proposals that calls upon the recent resolution of Saudi Arabia and France, and can securely and effectively take back control of Gaza. This is where the very important addition comes in. After the Palestinian Authority reform program is faithfully carried out and Gaza redevelopment has advanced, the conditions may finally be in place for a credible pathway to Palestinian self-determination and statehood. The United States will establish a dialogue between Israel and the Palestinians to agree on a political horizon for peaceful and prosperous coexistence. What we are seeing here is, first of all, that the United States has removed Israel's veto. In the initial draft proposal, the Palestinian Authority was going to undergo reforms that would be acceptable to the Board of Peace and to Israel. Israel is not mentioned now in those reforms of the Palestinian Authority. Instead, what it says is that the Palestinian Authority is going to undergo reforms as envisioned by the initial Trump 2020 peace plan and by the Saudi-French proposal, and also says that this will then possibly lead to a pathway towards Palestinian self-determination and a Palestinian state. All things that did not exist in the initial proposal. So we have the removal of Israel's veto power over saying that the Palestinian Authority has successfully completed its reforms or not. And also we have laying the foundation by the UN Security Council in a United States proposal that these reforms and the Palestinian Authority taking over the Gaza Strip may lead to a Palestinian state. All things that are very different and have caused a lot of anger within the Israeli government. Moving on to a next change that happened in Article 3. Article 3 talks about the distribution of humanitarian aid in the Gaza Strip. Like the initial proposal, the proposal that was submitted says that this resolution underscores the importance of full resumption of humanitarian aid in cooperation with the Board of Peace into the Gaza Strip and through cooperating organizations, including the United Nations, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the Red Crescent, and ensuring that such aid is used solely for peaceful uses and not diverted by armed groups. So again, Article 3 simply says that humanitarian aid will come in, be distributed by the United Nations, not by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and that aid should not and cannot be taken over by armed groups. What is interesting is that that phrasing of Article 3 ends there. But the initial draft proposal had another sentence after that. And after saying that we have to make sure that the aid is not diverted by armed groups, it said, any organization found to have misused such aid will be deemed ineligible for continued or future assistance. In other words, the initial draft resolution said, and any aid organization that misuses the aid or possibly allows it to be diverted by armed groups will then not be eligible to ever receive any aid again and be part of these international organizations. Now that was taken off. That is no longer part of the draft proposal that was submitted by the United States. Very little changes were made in Article 4, which talks about the different mechanisms that the Board of Peace is going to use in order to try to implement the different ideas about Gaza rebuilding, the reconstruction of Gaza, economic recovery programs, measures to facilitate movement of persons in and out of Gaza. All that is the same as it was in the initial proposal. Article 5 also talks about the different oversight mechanisms of the Board of Peace and Palestinian police officers. And Article 6 calls upon the World Bank to fund the activities of the Board of Peace. Again, there were very little changes that were made in these articles. Article 7, another very important change, and possibly the second most important change that was made, relates to the deployment of the International Stabilization Force. That is, again, supposed to be the security mechanism that is supposed to take over in the Gaza Strip as the Israeli military withdraws. In the initial proposal, again, the draft from last week, forgive me for looking down, I'm looking at two different drafts here. In the draft from last week, it said that the International Stabilization Force, the ISF, would deploy with a unified command under the Board of Peace in coordination with Egypt and with Israel, and will use all necessary measures to carry out its mandate consistent with international law. It also said that the Board of Peace would, alongside the newly trained Palestinian police officers, work to help secure borders, stabilize security environment in Gaza, demilitarize the Gaza Strip, including the destruction and prevention of rebuilding of military, terror, and offensive infrastructure, as well as the permanent decommissioning of weapons and from non-state armed groups, protect civilians, and also protect humanitarian operations. All that still exists in the proposal that was actually submitted. What was added, however, is something that did not exist in the initial draft, and that is also recognizing when there's going to be a withdrawal of the Israeli military. That was not mentioned in the initial UN Security Council proposal. Now it says, in addition to all of those things that the ISF is going to do, Article 7 adds, as the ISF establishes control and stability, the Israeli Defense Forces will withdraw from the Gaza Strip based on standards, milestones, and timeframes linked to demilitarization that will be agreed between the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, ISF, International Stabilization Force, the guarantors in the United States, safer security perimeter presence that will remain until Gaza is properly secure from any resurgent terror threat. That is a copy-paste from Trump's 20-point plan. Trump's 20-point plan says that the Israeli military will withdraw based on milestones and agreements with the ISF. They simply copy-pasted that now into the resolution. That's very important for two reasons. First, it links the establishment of the ISF to an Israeli military withdrawal. In the initial draft proposal, it said that we are going to have the development of this international stabilization force in the Gaza Strip, and it didn't say anything about the Israeli military withdrawing. Now, if this is accepted by the UN Security Council, the United States will also be obligated to enforce that as the ISF is established, the Israeli military withdraws from the Gaza Strip. The second thing that's also noteworthy is, despite that addition, it still doesn't say how that's going to happen. This is something that I mentioned when I analyzed Trump's 20-point plan, saying that this will happen based on standards, milestones, and timeframes linked to demilitarization agreed upon by Israel, the ISF, and the guarantors, doesn't really tell us. So how long is that supposed to take? Is that going to happen next month, or is that going to happen in 6 months? Is Israel going to be the one that decides demilitarization has happened enough such that it can withdraw? Or is the United States going to be the one that decides that? This doesn't really say. So it's a very important addition, but still doesn't give us a lot of clarity. Other than that, all the articles remain the same. The Board of Peace and this entire plan is supposed to be established and have its authority until December 31st of 2027. So by the time it would be implemented now, it would be 2 years. The only other addition that was made is that now an article was added, Article 10, that says that the Board of Peace is required to provide a written report on progress related to the above UN Security Council resolution every 6 months. So, summarizing, the most important changes that were made in the proposal that was submitted by the United States, I would argue, are, first of all, that Israel's veto was removed with regards to saying when the Palestinian Authority has carried out enough reforms, and also saying that once the Palestinian Authority carries out enough reforms, it will then be a pathway towards taking over the Gaza Strip and possibly laying the foundation towards a future Palestinian state. So that's the first biggest addition. The second one was linking the establishment of the ISF to the withdrawal of the Israeli military. And again, that's important not because it gives us the actual technicalities of how that will happen, but that is important because that means the United States will be responsible to the Security Council to answer for the fact that if the Israeli military does not withdraw as the ISF is established, then who is supposed to impose that? Theoretically, it would be the United States. All of these additions were very likely done under the pressure of the different negotiating countries, Turkey, Qatar, and Egypt. And what is somewhat indicative of that is hours after the United States submitted this to the United Nations Security Council, a joint statement was made by the United States that was supported by Qatar, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Pakistan, Jordan, and Turkey. And they all said that this proposal, quote, offers a pathway to Palestinian self-determination and statehood. We emphasize that this is a sincere effort and the plan provides a viable path towards peace and stability, not only between the Israelis and the Palestinians, but for the entire region. So what we are seeing is that very likely the negotiating countries applied pressure on the United States, and the United States adjusted the resolution accordingly, and now it has the support of virtually all the actors in the region that are involved in this. Noteworthy, the ones who have not expressed any support for this are Hamas or Israel. Once again, we are seeing, like with the acceptance of the 20-point plan, the United States is talking to Turkey, Qatar, Egypt, Indonesia, Pakistan, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, all these countries proposing things. Israel, very unhappy with these additions. It hasn't put out any statements for or against this resolution. Hamas hasn't really said anything about demilitarizing what's going to happen. And at this point, the actual fighting sides seemingly are not a party to these ongoing negotiations at this point. Two more things I'm going to say just about the proposed resolution in the Security Council, and then I'll take some questions and move on to a couple other things. Also important to note that while this is being put forth, it is not for sure going to pass as is in the UN Security Council. Russia, China, and Algeria is also currently in the Security Council, but Russia and China, veto members, are not happy with this resolution. Each one of them are having their own levels of critique. Among others, China said that it wants the resolution to talk about a peace plan between Israel and the Palestinians and not to mention Trump's plan at all. Russia, Algeria, and France all said that they want a clearer declaration that there will be a Palestinian state in the future. China, Russia, and some of the European countries also wanted more clarification about the board of peace. So at this point, the resolution is going to be voted upon in the coming days, but very likely it's going to still undergo further adjustments. It may pass, or it may still go back to further deliberations. But the big news is that as far as the United States is concerned, what it is bringing to the negotiating table are those changes that Israel is very unhappy about. And the last thing I'll say with regards to that, it was in this context also that it was reported that Steve Witkoff, the chief negotiator of the United States, is going to be meeting with Khalil al-Hayya, the chief negotiator of Hamas, in order to discuss the future implementation of the ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. So while I said that Israel and Hamas are not party to this, the United States is aware of that. Israel at this point is doing anything the United States says. So seemingly the United States simply thinks it will just go ahead with this and Israel will agree. But the United States is also opening a direct channel to Hamas to not just go through Turkey, Qatar, or Egypt, but opening a direct channel to further those negotiations. I'm going to pause here for some questions. Then I'm going to talk about a couple more things before wrapping up. Becca says that this sounds so convoluted. Welcome to international resolutions. They are always convoluted. They're always about adding this word or that word. It's always something that will give you a headache. The quote, reforms would be a generational project, not something for a year or even 5 years. I very much agree. One of the Trump proposals to rebuild Gaza that was called the Great Trust, it was about the United States taking over the Gaza Strip and rebuilding its smart cities as a local hub of industry and et cetera. Even that talked about a 10-year project. So at this point, it's very unlikely to take just 1 or 2 years. I fully agree with that. Other questions I am looking at. So phase 2 is just everything else. Yes, indeed. Question. Hamas claims that they did not agree to disarm. Is that a true statement? Sorry if you already answered this. No worries. Thank you, Barry. The question is, Hamas claims that they did not agree to disarm. Is that a true statement? At this point, Hamas is not a signatory on the agreement. The agreement, neither is Israel for that matter. The agreement was signed in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt between the United States, Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey. So both sides can claim they actually did not agree to every item in this. So in that sense, yes, it's a true statement. Hamas did not agree to disarm. In fact, in going along with this agreement, Hamas has said that they are going to live out the terms of the ceasefire. The terms, one would argue, includes disarming, but Hamas could also make the argument that says, well, one is not linked to the other. We are fulfilling that side of the deal. We never agreed to that. So convoluted answer. Legally, if it was before a court of law, Hamas could have deniability and say, we did not actually agree to this. In practice, they are going along with a deal that says they are supposed to disarm. Other question, which international protagonist or antagonist is a resolution to this of any positive interest? Krabus, I'm going to try to clarify that question for me because I'm a little bit confused. Fran is saying that I pronounced Sheikh correctly. Thank you. Questions about the West Bank. Very good question. I'll talk about the West Bank in a moment. So I'm pausing here for another 5 seconds before jumping in because I try to keep these to an hour. I'm going to try to go a little bit more because there's a couple of things I wanted to hit, but I'm going to try to go a little bit faster. So I'm pausing here just for a moment. So a couple more things, and then I'll try to field some of the questions at the end. A couple more things with regards to the preparing of phase 2. There are just interesting reports from the last week. First of all, one of the reports is that Turkey is already in the process of training some 2,000 soldiers to take part in the International Stabilization Force. That's very important because Israel has made public that it does not want Turkish troops in the Gaza Strip. Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, has long been a very big critic of Israel and somewhat a defender of Hamas, and Israel does not want Turkey to have troops in the Gaza Strip. The ISF, the way it's worded in the resolution, makes pretty clear that Turkey would be part of it, because it says that the ISF will be made up of parties that are part of the Board of Peace. Turkey is part of the Board of Peace, so it is very likely that Turkey will take part in this. But that's also another interesting facet, that while Israel is making public it does not want Turkey to be part of this, Turkey's announcing we're already in the process of training 2,000 troops. In addition to that, Indonesia has also announced that they are training 20,000 military personnel to take part in the efforts in the Gaza Strip. They said efforts, so not necessarily fighting troops to be part of the ISF. Possibly this will be part of rebuilding Gaza, rebuilding infrastructure, industry, or whatever. But that's also important because Indonesia has, over the last year, gotten closer to the Trump administration and also made some indication that it may want to join the Abraham Accords. So that's also an interesting development. The EU is voting in the coming week on a program to train 3,000 Palestinian police officers as part of these efforts. And the Palestinian Authority in the last week stated that it is sending a delegation to UNESCO in order to start revamping its education program in order to meet international standards. Whether it does that or doesn't, they've said that in the past. Whether it does that or doesn't do that, the fact that they are saying this publicly is another indication that they are seeing that they are going to take part in whatever future developments in the Gaza Strip and are trying to showcase that they are living up to international standards, such as these reforms that are demanded of the Palestinian Authority would require. Those are some of the other developments with regards to the implementation of phase 2. I'm going to take one or two more questions about this, and then, just for a few minutes, bring up a couple more things that have happened in the last week in the different arenas, in Lebanon and in the West Bank. So, Crab Lewis asks, is it not of interest to many of the major international powers to keep this going indefinitely? Absolutely. Absolutely. At this point, the United States, the EU, some would argue even Russia and China have an interest in the ceasefire between the sides continuing. But because all of them have slightly different interests in how they'd like to see this turn out, if it will be a Palestinian state that is more loyal to Russia or to the United States, if it is a demilitarized Palestinian state, if it is a Palestinian state that is somehow involved in confederation within the surrounding countries or something like that, each one of them has a different interest. So at this point, they all have an interest in things not falling apart, but how it actually plays out, each one of them has a slightly different agenda. Other question that comes in, the EU won't send boots to Ukraine. That EU? Good question. Is this the EU that will not send troops to Ukraine? So there's two things that can be said about that. One, sending troops to Ukraine, which would mean NATO countries engaging with Russia, one would argue is far more dangerous than sending troops to the Gaza Strip. So one could say that the fact that the EU won't send troops to Ukraine does not necessarily mean that they will not get involved in Gaza. At the same time, I agree with those that are laughing at that question because, yes, it is also unlikely that the EU is going to take an active part in this. The EU is not made up of one standing army. It's made up of lots of different countries. Each one of them also, there's a vast difference between the position of France and the position of Hungary and the position of Poland and the position of Germany with regards to Hamas, Palestinian Authority, Palestinian statehood, Israel. So, yes, I agree that it is very unlikely that the EU is going to, as a whole, start sending in its troops to take over the Gaza Strip and bring peace to the Middle East, if you will. Two more things I just want to touch upon briefly, and then I'll pause and take any further questions. One is, I mentioned this already last week, and I think already 2 weeks ago even, while all eyes are focused on the Gaza Strip, we do need to be looking at two other arenas at least. One of them is Lebanon. In Lebanon, the ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon is right now in the most shakiest place that it has been since it was declared just over a year ago. The Lebanese government has publicly announced that they are not capable of disarming Hezbollah. This has led the situation to somewhat of a stalemate because the Israeli military is holed up in at least 5 locations in Lebanon and is carrying out almost daily airstrikes. But this is only supposed to happen until Hezbollah is disarmed. I said, I think 2 weeks ago, that Hezbollah and the Lebanese government were to some extent playing a game of chicken to see which one of them is willing to try to disarm the other one and possibly lead to civil war. And the Lebanese government seems to be the one that blinked first and has now said they're not going to try to disarm Hezbollah by force. But as a result, the situation is becoming increasingly volatile. More and more airstrikes of the Israeli military over the last week. Hezbollah made a statement. Naim Qassem, the leader of Hezbollah, made a statement saying that Hezbollah is now considering retaliating to these airstrikes, that is not willing to just sit idly by anymore. There's also been a development with pictures that emerged that Israel has started to construct a wall, a barrier, in the areas in Lebanon near Jiladir, which is an area, again, in the area, in the area near Avivim over here on the Lebanese side to block any sight and snipers into the Israeli territory. Lebanon said it's going to file a complaint with the UN Security Council about this. Situation getting increasingly volatile. So just something I'm mentioning, worth looking at that arena as well, because there could be a spark from there that then will radiate back to the Gaza Strip. Second arena, the West Bank. The West Bank, since the war began over 2 years ago, has become increasingly volatile with mass amounts of violence from all sides. The Israeli military carrying out massive operations against Palestinians and Palestinian refugee camps, scores, thousands of Palestinian attacks against Israeli settlers and against Israeli military, and hundreds of attacks of Israeli settlers against Palestinians as well as against the Israeli military. So all sides attacking each other. However, over the last several weeks, we have seen a dramatic increase in the attacks of Israeli settlers carrying out acts of terrorism against Palestinians. This has taken a variety of forms. Some of these are attacks against Palestinians that are trying to get to their olive groves, which is now the season of harvesting olives, which is a big industrial and economic factor in the West Bank. There's been lots and lots of attacks of Israeli settlers against Palestinians. We've also seen raids into different Palestinian villages, torching homes and torching industrial centers. And there's increasing criticism of the Israeli military that they are not stopping these attacks. Among others, and there's a whole list here over the last week. On November 12th, there was such an attack. On November 13th, a mosque was torched and vandalized. Graffiti was sprayed throughout the mosque, both saying very harsh words against the Islamic prophet, Muslim prophet Muhammad, as well as graffiti saying of Israeli settlers, "We are not afraid of Avi Balut," that is the chief commander of the Israeli military forces in the West Bank. So in other words, Israeli settlers saying they're attacking Palestinians, but also saying they're not afraid of the military and its possible attempts to stop them. Over the last week, there's been increasing reports of the Israeli military itself saying we have a problem. The, again, commander of the forces, Avi Balut, said that the situation is spiraling out of control, but there's a problem of jurisdiction. Not going to get into this. It's extremely complicated. But the Israeli military is saying that they don't have the means to stop the Israeli settlers because it's not within their mandate. Israeli settlers are subject to Israeli law. They're supposed to be stopped by the Israeli police and the Israeli Shabak, not by the Israeli military. The Israeli military does not actually have the authorization to stop the settlers. It's supposed to be there to defend the settlers against Palestinians. However, the Israeli police is under the control of the Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and there's increasing reports that he has given orders to the police to not stop those settlers from carrying out the attacks. All in all, the situation is just continuing to spiral, and it's, again, another arena that is somewhat going under the radar, but it's very important to look at. There was a report by the Israeli military saying there were upwards of 70 attacks per month of settlers against Palestinians only throughout 2025, and that these attacks are becoming increasingly violent. In fact, I believe, I'm looking through my notes here, I believe that the words the Israeli military used is that the attacks are becoming increasingly sadistic against Palestinians. And the situation is just, again, continuing to be a lot of fuel being poured over lots and lots of sparks, and it may lead to eventually to an explosion. Will it be limited to the West Bank or radiated to the Gaza Strip? Another question, but again, just another arena that's worth looking at this point. So with that, I'm going to take a look at a few questions. Why does the Israeli army just watch these settlers and Palestinians, these settler Palestinian attacks? So again, the Israeli military, according to Israeli law, is required to defend Israelis from Palestinians. So when there's a Palestinian attack against Israelis, the Israeli military intervenes. However, according to Israeli law, settlers that live in the West Bank are not subject to the Israeli military law. They're subject to the Israeli law. Therefore, the jurisdiction to arrest them falls on the Israeli police, not on the military. That is one of the reasons that we have sometimes what is even caught on camera, situations where where Israeli settlers are marching into a Palestinian village, and the Israeli military is walking behind them, not engaging, because they are actually there to protect them, because their mandate is if the Palestinians defend themselves by throwing stones or with gunfire, the Israeli military is supposed to protect the Israeli settlers. It's a bit of a nightmare when it comes to jurisdiction. I will say that in the coming week, I plan on uploading a video, not so much talking about this, more talking about the origins of the name West Bank, because a lot of people say, why do you call it West Bank, not Judea and Samaria? I might try to relate a little bit to the matters of jurisdiction, but suffice to say at this point, it's a bit of a jurisdiction nightmare, but that is one of the reasons the Israeli military, some could argue and have argued that also there is no will of Israel to stop these attacks. What I'm saying is even if there was a will, the Israeli military actually does not have jurisdiction to try to stop those attacks. With that, I'm pausing to see if there's any final questions. I went over the hour, which is what was going to be my mark for today. Again, apologies to anyone who I missed their questions. Feel free to send them in again. I am now going to put into the chat one more time for those who came in late a link. That is a link to a newsletter that I am setting up of the Israel-Palestine Report. A bunch of people have already signed up. I have not sent out any emails yet. I am at this point just collecting emails. I'm going to try to use it in order to inform people when I'm having these lives, other options for Q&A, other lectures I'm going to give, or other things like that. Feel free to sign up. I promise not to spam anyone. Like I said, I haven't even sent out any emails yet, so feel free to sign up. Other than that, any other questions, feel free. Okay, giving it one more minute. So the question was asked again, is there any information about Palestinians from the West Bank that would possibly be allowed to work in Israel? I will say at this point, no, there is not a lot of news about that. There was a mass freeze on permits of Palestinians from the West Bank working in Israel when the war broke out. It was then somewhat eased over the course of 2024. At this point, there's no indication that there's going to be a major change in that. It would, among others, not be politically beneficial for those in the Israeli government right now, because this would come under the purview of Minister Smotrich, Bezalel Smotrich of religious Zionism. So at this point, it is unlikely that we will see such a change until the next elections in Israel. Thank you, friend. With regards to the question of, there was this case that happened this past week of 150 Palestinians from Gaza that were flown to South Africa, but then got stuck on the plane because South Africa will not let them off. I don't know that much about this. According to what I read, this is from an organization that is coordinating with Israel in order to allow for Palestinians to leave the Gaza Strip to other countries. Typically, these are Palestinians that have foreign citizenship, so they are leaving to other countries, but they don't need a special visa to get into those countries. According to reports, these Palestinians were allowed to leave from Gaza to the Ramon airport in southern Israel and then flown to South Africa. From there, South Africa refused to allow them in, even though, again, theoretically, they all had permits. I'll be honest, I don't actually know what was the technical mishap there or where things ended up, so I apologize for that. To some extent, once it leaves the area of the Middle East, it falls off my radar a little bit. That's on me. Dav asks, any update on the Houthis? Nope, the Houthis are alive and well. They are alive and well in Yemen. They have stopped their attacks against Israeli targets. They, since the war broke out, said that they are going to attack Israel as long as there is no ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. From the moment the ceasefire was declared, they stopped firing drones, they stopped firing missiles. However, very likely, they will again start firing missiles and drones if and when the violence breaks out. Crab Lewis, question. I'm reading more in conservative Israeli media accusations and suggestions that the military leadership structure is in contention with elected leadership due to secular versus religious. Is this true? At this point, I would say that is not very true. The Israeli political establishment has taken upon itself to chastise anyone within the non-elected officials, anyone from the former chief of staff, Herzl Levy, to the current chief of staff that was appointed by them, Eyal Zamir. Anytime something goes wrong in the Gaza Strip, the Israeli government has said it's not the government, it's all because the Israeli military isn't doing its job. The same thing happened with the former head of the Israeli Shabak, Ronen Bar. Same thing has happened with the other different officials within Israel. There is not a big distinction in the demographics between the leadership in the Knesset and the Israeli military. At this point, I would chalk that up more to rhetoric. Okay. With that, I'm going to thank everyone for joining. Again, look out for my video. I'll probably try to put it out on Wednesday or Thursday, where I'm going to talk about the West Bank. Again, it's going to be a very technical video, not the updated news on the West Bank, more where the West Bank came from, why is it called the West Bank, and how do we understand it politically. And with that, feel free, anyone who has joined, I'll just remind everyone, my name is Alon Burstein. I'm a professor of political science and Israel Institute Fellow at Tufts University. And to those of you who are tuning in again for the first time, you're watching the Israel-Palestine Report with Professor Alon Burstein. So hit that subscribe button and let's dive in. Thank you, everyone. I am signing off. Have a lovely weekend.